A wedding in 1903 seemed perfect until the mirror revealed a dark secret. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like something was watching you from within the frame? In 1903, a wedding photograph captured what should have been the happiest day of two people's lives. But hidden in the reflection of an ornate mirror behind the happy couple, something impossible appeared, something that would haunt their family for generations to come. Today, we're diving deep into this chilling mystery that blurs the line between reality and the unexplainable. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to tell you about my other channel where I'm developing similar mysterious content. Check it out in the description below. Now, let's uncover what really happened on that seemingly perfect wedding day in 1903. The morning of June 14th, 1903, dawned bright and clear over the small town of Ashford, Connecticut. The air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass as the Morrison estate prepared for what everyone anticipated would be the social event of the season. Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, 23 years old with porcelain skin and dark auburn hair, stood before her bedroom mirror in her mother's wedding gown, carefully altered to fit her slender frame. The gown was exquisite, ivory silk with delicate lace overlay, pearl buttons running down the back, and a train that swept elegantly across the polished wooden floors. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as her younger sister Margaret fastened the last button. Through the open window, she could hear the arriving carriages, the murmur of early guests, and the distant sound of the string quartet tuning their instruments in the garden. "You look absolutely radiant, Ellie," Margaret whispered, adjusting the orange blossom wreath that held Eleanor's veil in place. "Thomas is the luckiest man in Connecticut." Thomas Bradford Henley was indeed considered quite the catch. At 28, he had recently taken over his father's successful textile mill and was known throughout the county as both shrewd in business and charming in society. He stood 6 feet tall with sandy blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that had won Eleanor's heart at the Harvest Ball 2 years prior. Their courtship had been proper and well chaperoned, as befitted their social standing, and their engagement announcement had delighted both families. The ceremony took place in the Morrison family's grand parlor, which had been transformed into a bower of white roses, lilies, and trailing ivy. Reverend Matthews, from the First Congregational Church, presided over the vows as nearly 100 guests crowded into the space, women in their finest day dresses and elaborate hats, men in dark suits with stiff collars. Eleanor's father, Judge Robert Whitmore, walked her down the makeshift aisle with visible pride, though those who knew him well noticed the slight sheen of tears in his usually stern eyes. Thomas stood at the makeshift altar, his best man and brother, William, beside him. When Eleanor appeared in the doorway, Thomas's expression transformed into one of such genuine joy that several guests later remarked they had never seen a man look so completely happy. The vows were exchanged without hesitation, voices clear and steady. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, the parlor erupted in applause and the quartet began playing a triumphant march. The reception flowed seamlessly into the afternoon. The dining room table groaned under the weight of the wedding feast. Roasted duck, glazed ham, fresh oysters shipped from Boston, delicate pastries, and a towering 4-tiered cake decorated with spun sugar roses. Champagne flowed freely, toasts grew increasingly sentimental and amusing, and the atmosphere was one of unrestrained celebration. As the afternoon light began to soften into early evening, the photographer, Mr. Heinrich Vogel, a German immigrant known for his meticulous work and modern equipment, suggested it was the perfect time for the formal portraits. He had set up his camera in the library, a room chosen specifically for its excellent natural light and elegant backdrop. The library featured floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, a marble fireplace, and most prominently, an enormous gilt-framed mirror that dominated the wall behind the photographer's position. The mirror was a family heirloom, brought over from France by Eleanor's grandmother. It measured nearly 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, with an ornate Baroque frame featuring carved cherubs, flowers, and scrollwork covered in gold leaf. Eleanor had always found it slightly unsettling as a child, something about the way the old glass seemed to hold shadows, even in bright light, but her mother assured her it was simply the imperfections in antique mirror silvering. Mr. Vogel arranged the couple carefully. Thomas stood slightly behind Eleanor, his hand resting on her shoulder, while she sat in a velvet chair, her dress arranged to show its full splendor. The photographer fussed with the lighting, adjusting reflectors and making minute changes to their positions. Several members of the wedding party gathered to watch the process, chatting quietly among themselves. "Hold very still now, Mr. Vogel instructed in his thick accent, disappearing beneath the black cloth of his camera. "The exposure will take nearly 30 seconds. Do not move. Do not even blink if you can help it." Eleanor and Thomas froze, maintaining their carefully composed expressions. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, momentarily dimming the light before it brightened again. Mr. Vogel counted down softly in German, and finally, the shutter clicked. "Perfect," he declared, emerging from beneath the cloth with a satisfied smile. "That will be a beautiful photograph, I promise you." If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps so much. The newlyweds relaxed, laughing at how difficult it had been to remain motionless. They rejoined their guests for more dancing and celebration. The party continued well into the evening, with lanterns lit in the garden and music drifting through the warm June night. No one present that day could have imagined what Mr. Vogel's camera had actually captured, or how that single photograph would become the source of a mystery that would never be solved. 3 weeks after the wedding, a package arrived at the Henley residence, a modest but elegant townhouse on Maple Street that Thomas had purchased and furnished for his new bride. Eleanor was in the morning room, writing thank you notes for wedding gifts, when the housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, brought in the parcel. "It's from that photographer fellow, Mrs. Henley," she said, her Irish accent still thick despite 20 years in America. "Heavy thing it is." Eleanor's face lit up with excitement. She had been eagerly anticipating the wedding photographs, knowing they would be treasured keepsakes. She carefully unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a leather portfolio embossed with Mr. Vogel's studio name. Inside were multiple photographs mounted on thick cardstock, the ceremony, groups of guests, family portraits, and finally, the formal portrait from the library. She lifted the large portrait photograph into the light from the window. The image was remarkably clear, a testament to Mr. Vogel's skill. There she sat, looking perhaps a bit solemn due to the long exposure time, but beautiful in her wedding gown. Thomas stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his expression proud and tender. The details were extraordinary. You could see individual pearls on her dress, the texture of Thomas's suit fabric, even the titles on some of the books in the background. Eleanor smiled, pleased with how well it had turned out. She was about to set it aside when something in the photograph caught her eye. She looked closer, squinting slightly. In the large mirror behind them, there was a reflection. As expected, it showed the backs of herself and Thomas, the room beyond them, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the mirror's reflection, standing directly behind Thomas, was the figure of a woman. Not Margaret, not her mother, not any of the wedding guests who had been in the room that day. This was someone else entirely. The figure was indistinct, slightly blurred, as if captured in motion, despite the long exposure time that should have made any movement appear as a complete smear. What Eleanor could make out sent a chill down her spine. The woman, if it was indeed a woman, wore what appeared to be a dark dress, possibly black, from a much earlier era based on the visible silhouette. Her face was turned slightly away, but Eleanor could make out what seemed to be long, dark hair and pale skin. Eleanor's hands began to tremble. She set the photograph down on the table, stood up, and walked to the window, trying to calm her racing heart. She was being foolish, she told herself. It must be a trick of the light, a flaw in the photographic process, perhaps a double exposure where an image from another photograph had accidentally transferred onto theirs. But even as she thought this, she knew it wasn't true. Mr. Vogel was meticulous in his work. And besides, the figure was clearly within the mirror's reflection, positioned in a specific location in the room, directly behind where Thomas had been standing. Eleanor remembered that moment with perfect clarity. She had been acutely aware of everyone in the library during the photograph. The wedding party had been standing near the door, several feet away. No one had been behind Thomas. No one at all. She forced herself to return to the table and examine the photograph again. The figure was definitely there, impossible to dismiss once you had seen it. Eleanor picked up a magnifying glass from Thomas's desk and studied the image more closely. The mysterious woman seemed to be looking down, her posture somehow conveying sadness or perhaps resignation. There was something about the tilt of her head, the way her shoulders seemed to slump. "Mrs. Henley, are you all right? You've gone quite pale." Mrs. O'Brien had returned with tea, her face creased with concern. "I'm fine," Eleanor lied, quickly turning the photograph face down on the table. "Just a bit tired, that's all." After Mrs. O'Brien left, Eleanor considered her options. She could show the photograph to Thomas, but he was at the mill and wouldn't return until evening. She could take it to her parents, but the thought of her father's dismissive pragmatism and her mother's tendency toward hysteria made her hesitate. She could return to Mr. Vogel's studio and demand an explanation, but what would she say? That his photograph had captured a ghost? The word hung in her mind, heavy and frightening. A ghost. Was that what she was looking at? Eleanor had been raised in a rational household. Judge Whitmore had no patience for superstition or supernatural nonsense. She had been taught to seek logical explanations, to trust in science and reason. But what logical explanation could there be for a figure appearing in a photograph when no one had been there? As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself repeatedly drawn back to the photograph. Each time she looked, the figure seemed clearer, more defined, as if her continued attention was somehow bringing it into sharper focus. She noticed details she had missed before. The woman's hands seemed to be clasped together at her waist, and there appeared to be something around her neck, possibly a necklace or a high collar. When Thomas finally came home that evening, he found Eleanor still in the morning room, the photograph lying face up on the table before her, though she had covered it with a piece of linen. "Darling, why are you sitting in the dark?" He crossed the room to light the lamp, kissing her forehead as he passed. "Did the photographs arrive? I've been eager to see them. Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far." Eleanor hesitated, then slowly removed the linen covering. "They did. They're beautiful. But Thomas, there's something you need to see." Thomas's initial reaction to the figure in the mirror was exactly what Eleanor had expected: rational skepticism tempered with growing unease. He held the photograph under the lamp, turning it this way and that, examining it from different angles, as if the mysterious figure might simply be a trick of perspective. "It's undoubtedly strange," he admitted, setting the photograph down and rubbing his eyes. "But there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps someone walked through the frame during the exposure without us noticing. Or it could be a defect in the photographic plate, some sort of chemical staining that coincidentally resembles a human figure." "Thomas, look at it carefully," Eleanor insisted, sliding the photograph back toward him. "It's not a stain or a blur. You can see details, the dress, the posture, even what might be jewelry. And it's positioned exactly where a person would stand if they were in that room, not just randomly appearing anywhere in the image." They sat in troubled silence for several minutes. Finally, Thomas made a decision. Tomorrow, I'll take this to Mr. Vogel's studio. He'll be able to explain what happened with the photographic process. I'm sure there's a rational explanation that we simply don't understand because we're not experts in photography. But Mr. Vogel had no explanation. When Thomas arrived at the studio the next morning, the photographer was setting up equipment for a portrait session. He greeted Thomas warmly, clearly pleased to see one of his satisfied customers. But when Thomas showed him the photograph and pointed out the figure in the mirror, Mr. Vogel's expression transformed from friendly professionalism to genuine confusion, followed by what appeared to be fear. "This is not possible," he said quietly, taking the photograph to his workbench where the light was strongest. He retrieved his own magnifying glass and examined every inch of the image. "I was there. I took this photograph. There was no one standing in that position. No one. Could it be a flaw in your process? A double exposure, perhaps?" Mr. Vogel shook his head emphatically. "I use a new plate for each photograph. This is the only image ever recorded on this particular piece of glass. And see here," he pointed with a pencil to various parts of the photograph. "Everything else is perfectly sharp and clear. If there had been any problem with the plate or the chemicals, it would affect the entire image, not create a distinct figure in one specific location. Then how do you explain it?" The photographer was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a low voice. "In Germany, in the old country, there are stories about cameras capturing things the eye cannot see. Some believe that the camera, it sees differently than we do, that it can record things from other times, other places. My grandfather, he was also a photographer, and he told me stories." "Surely you don't believe in such superstitions?" Thomas interrupted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I believe what I see, Mr. Henley, and what I see in this photograph should not be there." Thomas left the studio more unsettled than when he had arrived. He spent the morning at his office, attempting to work, but finding his thoughts constantly returning to the impossible figure in the mirror. Finally, he made another decision. He would visit Eleanor's family home and examine the library where the photograph had been taken. Perhaps there was something about that room, that mirror, that would provide an explanation. Judge Whitmore was in his study when Thomas arrived, surprised but pleased to see his son-in-law. Thomas explained the situation as matter-of-factly as possible, showing the judge the photograph. To his surprise, Judge Whitmore did not immediately dismiss the mystery. "That mirror," the judge said slowly, staring at the photograph with an unreadable expression. "It belonged to my wife's mother, brought over from France when the family emigrated. There was always something odd about it, though I could never quite say what." "Odd in what way?" "Just a feeling," the judge admitted, looking almost embarrassed to be discussing something so subjective. "My daughter Eleanor used to say she didn't like it as a child, that it made her uncomfortable. We kept it because my mother-in-law was quite attached to it, and after she passed, my wife refused to part with it. Family sentimentality, you understand. May I examine the library? The mirror specifically?" They went to the library together. In the daylight, the room looked perfectly ordinary, elegant, well-appointed, but nothing more. The mirror reflected the room accurately, showing nothing but what was actually there. Thomas stood in the exact spot where he had stood for the photograph, while Judge Whitmore positioned himself where Mr. Vogel's camera had been. "I don't see anything unusual," Judge Whitmore called out, but Thomas did. As he stood there, looking at his own reflection in the old mirror, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The shadows in the mirror seemed deeper than they should be, the reflections slightly off in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He was about to dismiss these feelings as imagination amplified by recent events when he noticed something else. On the mantelpiece, partially hidden behind a vase, was a small daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. He picked it up, brushing away a layer of dust, and found himself looking at a photograph from the mid-1800s, a young woman in a dark dress. His blood ran cold. The dress was similar to the one worn by the figure in the wedding photograph. The woman's dark hair, her pale complexion, even her posture as she sat for the long exposure required by early photography, it all seemed eerily familiar. Judge Whitmore? Who is this? The judge came over and took the daguerreotype, squinting at it. I believe that's Catherine Whitmore, my wife's great-aunt. She died quite young, I recall. Some sort of tragedy, though I don't remember the details. My wife might know more. Shall I call her? Mrs. Whitmore was summoned from her afternoon social calls. When shown the daguerreotype and then the wedding photograph, she went quite pale and had to sit down. Catherine, she whispered. Oh my goodness, I never believed the stories. What stories? Thomas demanded, a knot forming in his stomach. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, for whom her daughter had been named, sat in the library with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, gathering her thoughts before speaking. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, creating patterns on the carpet that seemed to shift and move as clouds passed overhead. Catherine Whitmore was my grandmother's younger sister, she began, her voice quiet but steady. She was born in France in 1832, and the family emigrated to America in 1847 when she was 15 years old. By all accounts, she was a beautiful, vivacious girl who quickly adapted to life in Connecticut. The mirror we're discussing was her most prized possession, a gift from an admirer in France, a young aristocrat who had hoped to marry her. Thomas and Judge Whitmore listened intently, neither interrupting. When Catherine was 19, she became engaged to a man named Charles Morrison, your ancestor, actually. Mrs. Whitmore nodded to her husband. The wedding was planned for June of 1851. She was very much in love, from what I understand from family letters. Everything was prepared, the guests invited, her wedding gown commissioned from the finest dressmaker in Hartford. She paused, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. The morning of the wedding, Charles Morrison was found dead in his room at the boarding house where he'd been staying. The doctor said it was his heart. He'd had a weakness unknown to anyone, apparently. He simply never woke up that morning. Catherine was devastated. According to family accounts, she refused to believe he was truly gone. She insisted on going to the church, still in her wedding gown, and had to be physically restrained from standing at the altar alone. How terrible, Thomas murmured. It gets worse, Mrs. Whitmore continued. Catherine's grief consumed her. She withdrew from society entirely, rarely leaving her room. She would spend hours sitting in front of that mirror, wearing her wedding gown, talking to it as if she could see Charles in the reflection. Her family was deeply worried, but in those days, there was little understanding of mental health. They simply hoped she would eventually heal. What happened to her? Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. On what would have been her first wedding anniversary, June 14th, 1852, the family found her dead in front of that mirror. She was wearing her wedding gown. There was no clear cause of death. Some said it was her heart, broken beyond repair. Others whispered darker things, that she had taken her own life, though there was no evidence of such. The doctor listed it as natural causes, but the family knew better. Catherine had simply lost the will to live. A heavy silence filled the library. Outside, birds sang in the garden, oblivious to the weight of the story just told. And the mirror, Judge Whitmore asked quietly. My grandmother couldn't bear to look at it after Catherine's death, but she also couldn't bring herself to destroy it or sell it. It had been Catherine's treasure. So it was kept, moved from room to room over the years, eventually ending up here in this library when we inherited the house. I never knew the full story until after we were married and my mother-in-law told me. I thought it was just family tragedy, the kind every family has in its history. Thomas looked at the mirror, then at the wedding photograph still lying on the table. June 14th, he said slowly. That was the date of our wedding. Mrs. Whitmore nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I didn't realize when Eleanor chose the date. June is such a popular month for weddings, and the 14th was simply a Saturday that worked well for everyone's schedules. I never thought to mention the coincidence. I never imagined That Catherine might appear in our wedding photograph, standing behind me as if she were attending the wedding she never had, Thomas finished, his voice hollow. They sat together as the afternoon wore on, discussing what should be done. Judge Whitmore wanted to dismiss the entire thing as coincidence and optical illusion. Mrs. Whitmore was convinced they should have the mirror removed from the house immediately, perhaps destroyed. Thomas didn't know what he believed, but he knew he needed to tell Eleanor the full story. That evening, the young couple sat together in their parlor while Thomas recounted everything he had learned. Eleanor listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. "The same date," she whispered when he finished. "June 14th. Thomas, when I was a little girl, I used to have nightmares about that mirror. I would dream of a woman in a dark dress standing in front of it, reaching toward me. My mother always said it was just childish imagination." "Perhaps it was," Thomas said, though he sounded uncertain. "Or perhaps Catherine has been there all along, watching through that mirror, waiting for another June 14th wedding to occur in the room where she had planned her own celebration." If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment down below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. They decided to put the photograph away, tucking it into a drawer in Thomas's study, where it wouldn't be seen daily. But neither of them could forget what it contained. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself thinking constantly about Catherine Whitmore, the young woman who had lost everything on what should have been the happiest day of her life, who had loved so deeply that she couldn't survive the loss. There was something deeply sad about the figure in the mirror, Eleanor realized. Not frightening, not malevolent, but heartbreakingly melancholy. Catherine wasn't trying to scare them or intrude on their happiness. She was simply there, bearing witness to the wedding she never had, perhaps seeking some small comfort in observing the joy she had been denied. Months passed. Summer faded into autumn, then winter. Thomas's business continued to thrive, and Eleanor settled into her role as a wife and society matron. To all outward appearances, they were the perfect young couple, prosperous, attractive, socially active. They attended parties and dinners, hosted their own gatherings, and were frequently mentioned in the society columns of the local newspaper. But between them, unspoken most of the time, hung the mystery of the wedding photograph. Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to research about Catherine Whitmore. She spent hours in the library of the local historical society, reading through old newspapers and family records. She discovered that Catherine had been known for her artistic talent, particularly her skill at watercolor painting. Several of her paintings had been preserved by the family, though most had been lost or destroyed over the years. In the Historical Society's collection, Eleanor found a journal that had belonged to Catherine, covering the year leading up to her planned wedding. She read it with a mixture of fascination and sadness, watching a young woman's joy and anticipation gradually transform into devastating grief. Catherine's entries about Charles were tender and sweet. She wrote about their walks together, their conversations about the future, the home they would build, the children they hoped to have. Her happiness radiated from every page. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The day after Charles's death, the journal ended. But tucked into the back of the journal, Eleanor found something unexpected, a letter never sent, addressed to Charles. It had been written on what would have been their first anniversary, presumably shortly before Catherine's death. The letter was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Catherine wrote about how she saw Charles everywhere, in the mirror most especially, as if he were standing just behind her, just out of reach. She wrote about how the mirror had become her solace, the one place where she felt his presence most strongly. She wrote about losing the will to continue without him, about how each day felt heavier than the last, how the world had lost its color and meaning. The final lines of the letter made Eleanor cry. "I do not fear death, my darling. I fear only a life without you in it. If there is any justice in this world, any mercy, I pray that when I close my eyes for the last time, I will open them again to find you waiting. And perhaps, in some distant future, in some way I cannot now imagine, I will be able to witness the joy I was denied, if only as a shadow, a reflection, a whisper of what might have been. Eleanor showed the letter to Thomas that evening. He read it silently, his expression grave, and when he finished, he looked at the drawer where the photograph was hidden. "She's not haunting us," he said quietly. "She's just there. Still loving, still hoping, still waiting." "Do you think she knows?" Eleanor asked. "Do you think she understands that she was captured in our photograph? I don't know. I don't know if there's any consciousness there, or if she's simply an echo, a residue of strong emotion left behind by tragedy. I don't know if ghosts, if that's even what we should call them, are aware of the present or trapped in their own past." They sat together in contemplative silence. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "I don't want to hide the photograph anymore. I know that sounds strange, but Catherine deserves to be acknowledged, not hidden away like something shameful or frightening." So they took the photograph out of the drawer and placed it on the mantelpiece in their parlor, where visitors would see it. And when people commented on what a lovely wedding portrait it was, Eleanor would smile and agree. Some noticed the figure in the mirror, and when they asked about it, Eleanor would tell them the story, not as a ghost tale meant to frighten, but as a tragedy that had somehow found its way into their own happy moment. The reactions varied. Some dismissed it as photographic trickery or pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and faces where none exist. Others were fascinated, requesting to examine the photograph more closely. A few were uncomfortable and changed the subject. But Eleanor noticed that those who listened to Catherine's story with compassion, who expressed sadness for the young woman's fate, seemed to see the figure more clearly in the photograph, while those who were skeptical or dismissive claimed they could barely make it out. As the years passed, the photograph remained on their mantelpiece through Thomas and Eleanor's entire marriage. They had 4 children, all of whom grew up knowing the story of Catherine Whitmore. The children treated the photograph with respect but not fear, understanding that it represented both joy and sorrow intertwined, the mystery of love and loss that touches all human lives. Eleanor continued to research Catherine's life, collecting what information she could find and preserving it for future generations. She discovered that Charles Morrison had been a kind man by all accounts, devoted to Catherine, and that his sudden death had shocked everyone who knew him. In a strange way, Eleanor felt she was helping to keep their love story alive, ensuring that both Catherine and Charles would not be forgotten. The mirror itself remained in Judge Whitmore's library for many years. After both of Eleanor's parents passed away and the house was inherited by her brother, he found the mirror unsettling and wanted it removed. Eleanor asked if she could take it, and it was moved to a room in her own home, not prominently displayed, but kept safe and respected. On June 14th of each year, their wedding anniversary, Eleanor would stand before the mirror and speak softly to Catherine, thanking her for being present at their wedding, acknowledging her loss, and promising that her story would not be forgotten. Whether Catherine could somehow hear or understand these words, Eleanor never knew, but it brought her comfort to speak them, to maintain this connection across the decades between their respective wedding days. Thomas, initially skeptical but gradually accepting of the mystery, would sometimes join Eleanor in these quiet annual observances. "To Catherine and Charles," he would say, raising a glass, "may they have found each other again wherever they are." Neither Thomas nor Eleanor ever received a definitive explanation for how Catherine's image appeared in their wedding photograph. Mr. Vogel went to his grave insisting it was impossible by any photographic process he knew. Other photographers examined the image over the years, and none could provide a satisfactory explanation. Some claimed it was fraud, others suggested rare atmospheric conditions or unknown properties of light and reflection, but no one could replicate the effect or prove any theory conclusively. In the end, perhaps that was how it should be. Some mysteries don't need solutions, some questions don't need answers. The photograph remained what it had always been, a moment frozen in time when two realities seemed to touch briefly, when past sorrow and present joy existed simultaneously in a single frame. Eleanor lived to be 87 years old. Thomas preceded her in death by 3 years, and in her final months, Eleanor would sit before Catherine's mirror with the wedding photograph in her lap, studying it as she had hundreds of times before. Her grandchildren would ask her if she had ever been frightened by the mysterious figure, and she would always shake her head. Frightened? No, never. Saddened, yes. Moved, certainly, but never frightened. Catherine means us no harm. She's simply a reminder that love, true love, leaves traces that time cannot entirely erase. She's a reminder that joy and sorrow are often separated by the thinnest of margins, that fate can be cruelly arbitrary, and that bearing witness to others' happiness is sometimes all that remains to those who lost their own. The photograph was passed down through the family, along with the mirror and Catherine's journal. Each generation learned the story, and each had their own interpretation of what the image meant. Some believed it was genuinely supernatural, evidence that the dead sometimes linger in places and moments that meant something to them in life. Others thought it was simply an extraordinary coincidence, a trick of light and shadow that human pattern recognition interpreted as a human figure. But everyone who heard the full story, Catherine's tragedy, the coincidence of dates, the letter found in her journal, agreed on one thing. Whatever the explanation, the photograph captured something profound about the nature of love and loss. It showed that our moments of greatest joy exist in a world still touched by others' sorrow, that happiness and tragedy are not separate experiences, but interwoven threads in the fabric of human existence. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. The wedding photograph of Thomas and Eleanor Henley, taken on June 14, 1903, still exists today, preserved in a climate-controlled archive along with Catherine Whitmore's journal and other family documents. Researchers and paranormal investigators have studied it extensively, employing modern photographic analysis techniques, but the mystery remains unsolved. Is it a ghost? A psychic imprint? A dimensional overlap? A photographic anomaly we still don't understand? Or simply shadows and aging chemicals arranged in a way that resembles a human figure, with the Catherine connection nothing more than meaningful coincidence? No one can say with certainty, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Because the true power of the photograph lies not in answering these questions, but in making us ask them, in making us wonder about the invisible boundaries between past and present, about whether love can truly transcend death, about whether our happiest moments might be witnessed by those who had their own happiness stolen away. Catherine Whitmore waited at the altar that never was. She stood in her wedding gown before a mirror, reaching for a reflection that could never return her touch. And on a June day, 52 years after her death, when another bride and groom celebrated their union in the same room where Catherine had planned her own joy, perhaps some echo of her consciousness, some residual energy of her profound longing, found a way to be present after all, not to haunt, not to frighten, not to intrude, simply to witness, simply to be there, even if only as a shadow in silver, for the wedding that would never be hers, standing eternally behind another groom on another June 14th, bearing silent witness to the happiness she had loved too much to ever truly let go. The mystery remains unsolved. The photograph endures. And Catherine Whitmore, whether as ghost or memory or photographic anomaly, continues to stand in that mirror, a reminder that some loves are so powerful they leave marks on the world that neither time nor death can fully erase.